They laughed at her simple gray sweater and modest demeanor. The rich women mocked her relentlessly at Caroline's elegant dinner party. What they didn't know, this unassuming redhead with the simple bun had just sold her furniture company for $750 million. Their faces when they discovered the truth? Priceless. Ruth Harper tugged self-consciously at the sleeve of her gray cashmere sweater as she stood at the threshold of Caroline's magnificent home. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the immaculate entryway. Fresh white roses adorned marble tables, their subtle fragrance mingling with the scent of expensive perfume. This was a world away from Ruth's modest townhouse. "I should have worn something different," she murmured to herself, smoothing down her simple black skirt. At 45, Ruth had never been one for luxury fashion, despite her means. She preferred comfort over couture, substance over style. A uniformed server approached with a silver tray of champagne flutes. Ruth took one with a grateful smile. She hadn't seen Caroline since college, over 20 years ago, but they'd reconnected online recently. Caroline had insisted Ruth attend her dinner party, saying she was dying to catch up. "Caroline will be down shortly," the server informed her. "The other guests are in the dining room." Ruth nodded and made her way toward the soft chatter and tinkling laughter. As she entered the opulent dining room, conversation momentarily ceased. 6 women in designer clothing sat around a table glittering with fine china and crystal. Each wore enviable jewelry and perfectly styled hair. Their eyes, sharpened by years of social competitions, took in Ruth's simple appearance with immediate judgment. "You must be Caroline's friend?" A blonde woman with a pearl necklace broke the silence, her voice honeyed, but her eyes cold. "Yes, I'm Ruth Harper. Caroline and I were roommates in college." "How charming," another woman replied, her voice suggesting it was anything but. "I'm Victoria. Please join us." Ruth took the empty seat, setting her small handbag beside her plate. She felt rather than saw the discreet exchange of glances around the table. "Caroline mentioned you're in furniture?" Victoria said, the final word delivered like a curious specimen to be examined. "Yes, that's right," Ruth answered simply. She never elaborated on her success unless necessary. Years of experience had taught her that people's reactions to wealth said more about them than any resume could reveal. "That must be interesting," offered a woman with an impressive diamond bracelet. "I'm Diane, by the way. My husband's in real estate development." "He just closed a $40 million deal on the East Side," added Victoria, with the rehearsed casualness of someone accustomed to dropping figures into conversation. Ruth smiled politely. "That sounds impressive." The women launched into a discussion of their husbands' business ventures and their own charity boards, designer purchases, and upcoming vacations. Ruth listened, occasionally sipping her champagne. "And what about you, Ruth?" Victoria finally asked. "What brings you back to town? Furniture shopping?" She laughed delicately at her own joke, the others joining in. "Actually, I'm here for a few meetings," Ruth replied honestly. What she didn't add was that those meetings were with her investment team about diversifying the enormous windfall from selling her company 6 months ago. "Oh, meetings. How exciting," drawled Diane, exchanging amused glances with Victoria. Ruth observed them calmly. She'd encountered this before, the immediate dismissal based on appearances. Once, it would have bothered her, but she'd long since learned that true worth wasn't measured in designer labels or status symbols. "Where is Caroline?" someone asked. "It's not like her to be late to her own dinner party." "She texted that she's running behind," Diane said. "Something about a delivery issue with the flowers." Ruth inwardly sighed. Without Caroline as a buffer, the evening stretched before her like a social minefield. Little did she know, the real ordeal was just beginning. "So, Ruth," Victoria leaned forward slightly, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Tell us more about this furniture business of yours. Do you have a little shop somewhere?" The dismissive tone wasn't lost on Ruth. She'd faced it countless times during her 20-year journey from garage workshop to industry leader. "I design custom pieces," Ruth answered simply. She could have mentioned her company's international presence or the celebrity clients who commissioned her work, but years of being underestimated had taught her the value of humility. "How quaint," Victoria replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think my housekeeper's daughter does something similar. Crafts, right?" Laughter rippled around the table, except from Ruth, who simply smiled politely. I imagine it must be difficult, Diane interjected, her voice dripping with insincere sympathy. Such a competitive market. My husband always says retail is a brutal business. Ruth took a sip of her champagne. It has its challenges. But surely it's just a hobby, pressed Victoria. Something to keep you busy? Another woman, who'd introduced herself as Bethany, glanced at Ruth's unadorned hands. No wedding ring. Never found time for family between all the furniture making? Ruth set her glass down carefully. I chose to focus on my business. Victoria shared a look with Diane. Well, we all make our choices. Some of us are just fortunate enough to have options. She adjusted her pearl necklace with manicured fingers. A server appeared, placing elaborately plated appetizers before each guest. Ruth noticed how Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly when she thanked the server by name. These look lovely, Ruth commented, admiring the artistic arrangement. Caroline employs the most sought-after private chef in the city, Bethany said. Impossible to book unless you know someone. My husband tried for months before I called in a favor. The restaurant he opened last year has already earned a Michelin star, added Victoria, studying Ruth for a reaction. Ruth nodded appreciatively. The food looks wonderful. Ruth, I'm curious, Diane said, delicately spearing a scallop with her fork. What brought you into furniture? It seems such an unusual choice. Before Ruth could answer, Victoria chimed in. Perhaps it's a family business? Something passed down? The implication was clear. They couldn't imagine someone choosing such a profession without inheritance or necessity. Actually, I started from scratch, Ruth explained. I studied design in college and always had a passion for creating functional art. Functional art, Victoria repeated, as if tasting something sour. How interesting. She means furniture that's both beautiful and practical, another woman, Margaret, translated unnecessarily. Yes, I gathered that. Thank you, Margaret, Victoria replied with a tight smile. Ruth observed the subtle power dynamics at play. Victoria was clearly the alpha of this social circle, with the others falling into familiar patterns around her. It was remarkably similar to corporate board meetings she'd attended, just with more expensive jewelry. Your sweater is quite comfortable looking, Bethany observed, her gaze lingering on Ruth's simple gray cashmere. Is that a fashion choice? Ruth's lips curved slightly. I prefer simplicity. Simplicity, Victoria echoed, exchanging glances with Diane. Well, not everyone can pull off couture. Or afford it, murmured someone else, just loudly enough to be heard. Ruth brushed an invisible crumb from her sleeve, unbothered. Her sweater, though understated, was actually handcrafted by an elderly artisan whose work she'd admired for years. It had cost more than Victoria's flashy dress, but Ruth saw no need to point this out. More champagne, Ruth? Diane offered, clearly hoping to move the conversation along. Ruth shook her head. I'm fine, thank you. Perhaps something stronger? You look like you could use it, Victoria suggested with a laugh that the others quickly echoed. As the laughter faded, Ruth caught a glimpse of her reflection in a polished silver candlestick, her simple red hair in its practical bun, her minimal makeup, her unassuming posture, all carefully cultivated over years of business negotiations, where being underestimated had worked to her advantage. Tonight was no different. Dinner progressed with the careful choreography of high society. Servers glided between chairs, replacing plates and refreshing glasses with practiced precision. Ruth observed it all with quiet interest, occasionally catching the eye of a server who seemed surprised by her genuine thank you each time. Did you see Eliza's new summer home? Victoria asked the table, pointedly excluding Ruth from her gaze. Waterfront, 6 bedrooms, and the most divine infinity pool overlooking the bay. I heard she paid nearly $12 million, Diane added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant to be heard. 12.5, corrected Bethany. My husband's firm handled the transaction. Ruth cut into her perfectly cooked steak, listening as the conversation flowed around her. These women measured their worth and others in square footage and price tags. What about you, Ruth? Margaret asked suddenly. Do you have a vacation property? All eyes turned to her, expecting either an admission of modesty or an unconvincing attempt to match their opulence. I have a cabin by a lake, Ruth answered honestly. What she didn't add was that her cabin encompassed 80 acres of pristine woodland with its own private lake, or that renowned architects had begged to design it. Victoria smirked. How rustic. I suppose that makes sense for someone in furniture. I grew up near the woods, Ruth explained. I find it peaceful. Well, not everyone needs luxury, Diane said with faux generosity. Some people are perfectly content with the simple things. Ruth could have mentioned that her property had been featured in architectural magazines, but she merely nodded. Exactly. The conversation shifted to charity galas and board positions. Names were dropped like coins into a fountain, each with an accompanying splash of importance. I'm chairing the Children's Hospital benefit this year, Victoria announced. We're hoping to raise $2 million. Wonderful cause, Ruth commented. She didn't mention her own anonymous 7-figure donation to that same hospital last month. Do you do much charity work, Ruth? Bethany asked, with the air of someone who already knew the answer. Before Ruth could respond, one of the servers approached her discreetly. Excuse me, Ms. Harper, there's a call for you. The gentleman says it's urgent. Ruth frowned slightly. Thank you, I'll take it in the hall. As she stood, Victoria raised an eyebrow. Business emergency with a furniture delivery? The table tittered with laughter as Ruth stepped away. In the hallway, she took the cordless phone offered by the server. Ruth Harper speaking. Ms. Harper, it's Alan from Westfield Trust. I apologize for disturbing your evening, but we need your approval on the transfer of funds for tomorrow's acquisition. It's the 8-figure transaction we discussed. Ruth glanced back toward the dining room. Yes, that's fine. Please proceed as planned. Excellent. The paperwork will be ready for your signature tomorrow at 10. Again, sorry to interrupt your evening. No problem at all. Thank you, Alan. Ruth handed the phone back to the waiting server, who hesitated before speaking. Ms. Harper, if you don't mind me asking, are you the Ruth Harper, the one who designed the Meridian collection? Surprised, Ruth nodded. Yes, that's me. The young man's eyes widened. My mother saved for 3 years to buy one of your coffee tables. She says it's the most beautiful thing she's ever owned. Ruth smiled warmly. That's very kind. What's your mother's name? I'd be happy to send her something from our new collection. Really? Her name is Grace Martinez. She would absolutely... There you are, Ruth! Diane's voice cut through the moment as she appeared in the hallway. We were beginning to think you'd escaped through a window. Her eyes flicked dismissively to the server, who quickly excused himself. Just a quick business call, Ruth explained. On a Friday evening, Diane linked her arm through Ruth's, guiding her back to the dining room. My husband never allows business calls during dinner. He says it's a sign of poor management if you can't delegate properly. Ruth said nothing as they returned to the table, where dessert was being served. The women barely acknowledged her return, already deep into discussion about an upcoming designer showcase. You simply must see Victoria's new collection, Bethany was saying as Ruth settled back into her seat. She's commissioned pieces from all the top designers. Her home looks like a museum. A curated museum, Victoria corrected with a satisfied smile. I can't stand clutter. Everything must have purpose and pedigree. Ruth sampled her dessert, a delicate lemon souffle that melted on her tongue. She noticed the women watching her, as if evaluating whether she could properly appreciate such refinement. And what's your decorating style, Ruth? Margaret asked. Do you use your own creations? The slight pause made the question sound more like an accusation than genuine interest. I keep things simple, Ruth replied, which was true. Her home featured carefully chosen pieces, many crafted by emerging artisans she'd discovered over the years. I imagine that's economical, Victoria said with a thin smile. Not everyone can afford to redecorate seasonally. I prefer quality over quantity, Ruth responded, maintaining her composure. Victoria leaned forward, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Speaking of quality, did I mention my husband just gifted me with a stunning piece for our anniversary? She extended her wrist, showcasing an ostentatious diamond bracelet. Custom design. Apparently, the stones alone are worth more than some people's homes. The women cooed appropriately, examining the jewelry with exaggerated enthusiasm. Ruth politely admired it when Victoria thrust her wrist in her direction. It's lovely, she said simply. Victoria's smile tightened. The designer said it's museum quality, something to pass down through generations. If you have children to pass things to, Diane added, with a pointed glance at Ruth. The implication stung more than Ruth expected. She'd chosen her career path deliberately, but these women made it sound like a failure rather than a choice. Not everyone's path includes marriage and children, Ruth said quietly. There are many ways to leave a legacy. Victoria laughed, a sharp sound that held no warmth. Oh, darling, no career compares to family. What's the point of success if you have no one to share it with? The others murmured in agreement, their wedding rings glinting under the chandelier light. I think success is defined individually, Ruth countered, her voice still even. For some, it's family. For others, it's creating something meaningful. Creating furniture, Victoria said, drawing out the word. Well, I suppose someone has to do it. The deliberate condescension was like a slap, but Ruth had faced worse in boardrooms dominated by men who thought a woman couldn't possibly understand business. Exactly, Ruth agreed pleasantly. Someone does. Victoria's eyes narrowed at Ruth's unflappable demeanor. She clearly expected Ruth to either wither under her scorn or lash out defensively. When neither happened, her tactics escalated. I don't mean to be rude, Victoria said, in a tone that suggested she meant exactly that. But that sweater, is it a hand-me-down? It looks rather worn at the elbows. Ruth glanced down at her sleeve. The sweater was actually less than a month old, but its muted color and simple design apparently read as cheap to these women. It's comfortable, she replied, refusing to defend her clothing choices. Comfort over style, Diane said with a laugh. How pragmatic. I always say, Victoria added, swirling her wine, you can tell a lot about someone by what they choose to wear. It's a statement about how you value yourself. Ruth met her gaze evenly. I couldn't agree more. Victoria's smile faltered slightly at Ruth's calm response. She'd expected embarrassment, perhaps even tears. Instead, she found herself facing a woman who seemed completely unbothered by her barbs. Well, Victoria continued, doubling down. I suppose when you work with your hands, fancy clothes would just get ruined. I'd hardly call it working with her hands, Bethany added with air quotes. It's more like arts and crafts for grown-ups. Laughter rippled around the table, sharp and excluding. Ruth remained silent, taking a sip of water. Oh, don't look so serious, Ruth, Victoria said, noticing her lack of reaction. We're just having a bit of fun. No need to be sensitive. Ruth set down her glass. I'm not sensitive, I just don't find humor at others' expense particularly amusing. The table fell silent. No one had expected such direct pushback. Before Victoria could respond, the dining room door opened. All heads turned as Caroline finally entered. Caroline swept into the room with the confident grace of someone accustomed to making entrances. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her black dress elegant yet understated. Unlike the other women, her only jewelry was a simple strand of pearls. I'm so sorry I'm late, everyone. The caterer had a mini crisis that needed my attention, she announced, then broke into a warm smile when she spotted Ruth. Ruth? You made it. She hurried over to embrace Ruth warmly, a genuine affection that contrasted sharply with the cool reception Ruth had received from the others. I've been so looking forward to catching up, Caroline said, taking the empty seat beside Ruth. It's been far too long. Victoria cleared her throat delicately. We've been entertaining your friend, Caroline. Such an interesting background she has. Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced around the table, clearly sensing the atmosphere. I hope everyone's been making Ruth feel welcome. An awkward silence followed, broken by Diane's overly bright, Of course. We've been fascinated hearing about her furniture hobby. Caroline's eyebrows shot up. Hobby? She looked at Ruth in confusion. Did you not tell them? Ruth shrugged slightly. It didn't come up. Tell us what? Victoria asked, her curiosity piqued despite herself. Caroline looked around the table, genuine surprise on her face. You mean none of you recognized Ruth Harper? The Ruth Harper? Blank stares met her question. Caroline laughed in disbelief. Ladies, Ruth isn't just in furniture. She founded Harper Designs, one of the most successful furniture companies in the country. Her pieces are in museums. Victoria's smile froze on her face. Harper Designs? The luxury furniture brand? The very same, Caroline confirmed. In fact, Victoria, That console table in your entryway that you bragged about last month. That's one of Ruth's designs. Victoria's face paled visibly. But that table cost a fortune, yes, Caroline finished for her. Ruth's work always does. And speaking of fortunes, she turned to Ruth with a grin. Should I tell them, or would you like to? Ruth shook her head slightly, but Caroline was already continuing. Ruth recently sold her company for $750 million. Cash deal. It was in all the business news last month. The silence that followed was deafening. 6 pairs of eyes stared at Ruth in disbelief, mentally recalculating everything they had assumed about the quiet woman in the simple gray sweater. $750 million? Bethany finally whispered, her voice cracking slightly. Actually, it was 752, Ruth corrected softly. But who's counting? Victoria's champagne glass nearly slipped from her fingers. But your clothes, you don't look rich, Ruth supplied, a hint of amusement finally breaking through her composure. I never saw the point in flashy displays of wealth. I prefer to let my work speak for itself. Diane was now staring at Ruth's simple sweater with new eyes. That's not just any cashmere, is it? Ruth smiled slightly. It's hand-loomed by a master craftsman in Scotland. He only makes 12 pieces a year. The phone call, Victoria said suddenly, comprehension dawning. That wasn't about a furniture delivery. Investment portfolio, Ruth confirmed. We're diversifying after the sale. Caroline was watching the reactions with barely concealed delight. Did I mention Ruth's philanthropic work? The children's wing at Memorial Hospital? That was her donation. Anonymously, of course. $20 million, Ruth admitted reluctantly. They needed a new oncology department. Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound. Just minutes earlier, she'd been boasting about raising $2 million for charity. But you never said anything, Margaret finally managed. All evening, while we were being completely condescending, Caroline supplied helpfully. Yes, I noticed that when I walked in. Not our finest moment as hostesses, ladies. Ruth shrugged. I've never been one to flaunt success. In business, being underestimated often works to my advantage. Well, Victoria said, attempting to recover her composure, this is certainly a surprise. Had we known, you'd have treated me differently, Ruth finished for her. That's precisely why I didn't mention it. People reveal their true character when they think they have nothing to gain from you. The table fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. The atmosphere in the dining room had transformed. Where there had been dismissive glances and barely concealed disdain, now there was an awkward deference. The women who had been so quick to judge Ruth based on her appearance were now stumbling over themselves to re-establish a connection. I've always admired entrepreneurs, Victoria said, her voice honeyed with newfound respect. The dedication it takes to build something from nothing is truly admirable. Ruth merely nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting this sudden change of heart. My summer home actually has several pieces from your collection, Bethany added eagerly. The craftsmanship is exquisite. I should have recognized your name immediately. You've only ordered through designers, Ruth pointed out quietly. We've never actually met. Diane leaned forward, her diamond bracelet flashing in the light. Ruth, I'd love to discuss a potential collaboration. My husband's development projects often need unique furnishings for the model homes. Caroline caught Ruth's eye across the table, raising an eyebrow in silent communication. They'd been close enough in college to recognize the absurdity of the situation. Ladies, Caroline interrupted smoothly, perhaps we could save the business proposals for another time? This is supposed to be a social evening after all. Victoria, clearly determined to salvage her standing, raised her glass. A toast, she declared, to Ruth and her remarkable success. We should all be so fortunate. The others quickly raised their glasses, murmuring agreement. Ruth lifted hers politely, but didn't drink. Success means different things to different people, she said simply. But surely, Victoria pressed, the financial reward must be gratifying, after all those years of work. She still couldn't quite bring herself to fully respect furniture making as a prestigious career. Ruth set her glass down. The money was never the point. I started designing furniture because I loved creating things that would become part of people's lives, pieces they'd gather around for family dinners or curl up on with a book. She paused. The fortunes it brought were secondary. How refreshingly humble, Diane said, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe it. Ruth smiled faintly. Not humble, just honest. Some of my happiest days were in my first workshop with sawdust in my hair and not a penny to my name. The women exchanged glances, clearly unable to comprehend valuing experience over affluence. Well, Margaret said brightly, clearly trying to move past the awkwardness, now you can enjoy the best of both worlds, all that money and the freedom to do whatever you want. Ruth nodded. Yes, freedom is the true luxury, the freedom to choose how I spend my time and with whom. Her gaze swept around the table, the implication clear. These were not the people she would choose. Caroline, sensing the tension, stood up. Why don't we move to the sitting room for coffee? Ruth, I want to hear all about that educational foundation you mentioned starting. As they moved from the dining room, Ruth found herself walking alongside Victoria, who was now making a determined effort to establish a more personal connection. I feel I should apologize for my earlier comments, Victoria said in a low voice. Had I known who you were? That's exactly the problem, Ruth interrupted gently. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat someone with basic courtesy. Victoria flushed. I didn't mean to suggest. Yes, you did, Ruth said, her voice still calm, but now tinged with steel. You meant that wealth and status determine how much respect someone deserves. That's a disappointing way to move through life. Victoria stopped walking, momentarily stunned by the directness. Ruth continued toward the sitting room, where Caroline was arranging coffee service. The other women were already seated, their body language noticeably different, more attentive, more deferential toward Ruth. The foundation? Caroline prompted as Ruth took a seat. Tell everyone about it. Ruth smiled, genuine warmth replacing her earlier reserve. We're creating educational opportunities for young people interested in traditional craftsmanship and design, full scholarships, apprenticeships with master artisans, business training. How charitable, Victoria commented, having recovered enough to rejoin the group. It's not charity, Ruth corrected. It's investment in talent that might otherwise be overlooked. She looked directly at Victoria, rather like I was this evening. The silence that followed was thick with understanding. As the evening drew to a close, Ruth stood on Caroline's front porch, waiting for her car. Caroline joined her, handing her a light wrap against the evening chill. I'm sorry about tonight, Caroline said softly. I had no idea they would behave that way. Ruth smiled. Don't apologize. It was illuminating, actually. Still, Caroline sighed. The way they changed once they knew about your success, it was almost grotesque. Ruth nodded, gazing out at the manicured gardens illuminated by strategic landscape lighting. Money doesn't change who we are, it just amplifies what's already there. And what about you? Caroline asked. Has your fortune changed you? Ruth considered this. I don't think so. I still value the same things: honesty, creativity, treating people with dignity, regardless of what they can offer me. Her car appeared at the end of the driveway, a modest sedan rather than the luxury vehicle her wealth could easily afford. That's why you'll always be rich in ways they can't understand, Caroline said, embracing her friend. As Ruth drove away, she reflected on the evening. Those women had everything society claimed was important: status, luxury, connections. Yet they seemed desperately unhappy, constantly comparing, judging, scrambling for position. True wealth, Ruth had learned long ago, wasn't measured in dollars or possessions. It was found in purpose, integrity, and the courage to remain authentic even when others dismissed you. Tonight was a reminder of why she'd always chosen substance over appearance, compassion over competition, and the quiet satisfaction of staying true to herself over the hollow validation of society's applause. What truly matters isn't what we have, but who we are when no one's looking. Remember that. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and remember, true worth isn't found in a bank account, but in the impact we make and the lives we touch.